right. Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Eggleston, and I run Course Report, which is a resource for students who are choosing a coding bootcamp. If you haven't used Course Report yet, this is my one shameless plug. I do it in all of our videos, but we've got thousands, over 40,000 alumni reviews that you can read about boot camps around the world, Q&As with students and instructors, everything that you need to choose the right coding bootcamp. And one thing that we've been doing recently is diving into these specific topics that you might hear about as you're researching coding boot camps. And today we're going to focus on Git, which is one of the first things that you're going to learn about at a boot camp. Git and version control, GitHub, you've probably heard of that tool. And so Tim Davis is joining as our expert today. He is an instructor at LearningFuze, which is a boot camp in California. Of course, they're teaching remotely right now because it's 2020. But he's taught version control and Git to a bunch of students. So he's going to join us today and walk through all of the version control jargon and vocab, the history of Git, and what you should do to learn it, and when you should learn it, and his favorite Git tutorials so that you can get started. So if you want more of a Git tutorial, we just published a separate video with Tim where he does a great 15-minute tutorial to kind of introing you to the Git workflow. We're going to link to that video here so that you can, if you want to, start with that one and watch that one first and follow along, then you can do that before you dive into this kind of overview of Git and version control. So thank you so much for being here, Tim. I have got a bunch of questions for you, but maybe just to start, do you want to tell us what you do at LearningFuze and why you've chosen to teach at LearningFuze specifically?
Sure. So currently, my job title is technically Chief Academic Officer. I sort of oversee all of the curriculum development here at LearningFuze. I also am an instructor. So I teach about halfway through the program, I will take over a given cohort. So right now we are running a 14-week full immersion intensive bootcamp. And at about the 8-week mark, that's when I take over, and students have already been exposed to fundamentals around HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and asynchronous JavaScript. So they start to tip into the more intermediate topics. And then when I pick up a class, that's when I start going over things like array methods in JavaScript, some of the ES6 features, and we start talking about things like client-server communication, databases, and then eventually React as well. As far as working for LearningFuze, I actually, I always tell this to all of my students, networking is the way to get your job. I was actually lead instructor at a different boot camp. And in my free time, I was participating in the Orange County developer community, speaking at meetups and things like that. I actually didn't know that TJ was in the audience when I was giving a presentation at a React meetup about Next.js. And when he found out that I was no longer working at my previous bootcamp, he asked, hey, we see that you've been having a lot of impact as a bootcamp instructor. We like that. You want to come hang out with us? I saw a really good opportunity to apply things that I had learned at the previous bootcamp I was working at. So I was really interested to see how I could adapt and scale those teaching approaches.
Amazing. Well, let's just dive in. Tell us what version control is. Can you explain it to a non-technical person?
Okay, let's take a really simple example. So you're working in something like Microsoft Word. If you make a mistake, it's possible for you to hit, Control Z or Command Z, something like that. So while you're actually working on a file, and this is, Word's just an example, you could also be thinking about something in Photoshop or maybe your audio producer, but these tools usually will have undo and redo capabilities, Control Z or Control Y or something like that. So what the program is actually doing is it's recording actions that you've taken so that if you want to go back in time, you can. And if you want to go back forward in time, then you can. Version control is a way for you to actually create snapshots of your work over time. And that way you can time travel through different versions of the code, for example, that you're working on. Even if you close out the program and it doesn't remember your control Z's or anything like that, you can still travel back in time to different versions of your work.
Okay, so that's kind of generally, you know, tracking changes and being able to return to different versions. And then what is Git? Is that the exact same thing as version control, just in programming?
Yeah, so Git is a specific implementation of version control. Git was created by Linus Torvalds. He's the guy who made the Linux kernel, or started the project anyway. And he was using another program that he absolutely hated. And so Linus Torvalds' style is to basically build his own tools if he hates the tools that are available. So he made this thing called Git. And Git, the whole purpose of it was to track changes being made to the Linux kernel as the community was working on it. So there are other alternatives. There's Subversion. You have Mercurial. There are other version control systems, but Git right now seems pretty dominant. And so most people are going to point you toward Git.
And I feel like you can't really hear Git without thinking of GitHub. So could you maybe just clarify for us what exactly is the difference between Git and GitHub?
Yeah, absolutely. So I still remember having this question myself. So Git is actually a tool that you can use on your own computer. We call that locally. So your own machine that you are working on, that's your local machine. And you typically will interact with Git in one of two ways on your local machine. You'll either use a command line interface, so you're typing into a prompt to tell Git to do things for you, or you can use a GUI tool. I think there's one called like Git Tower or something like that. But they both serve the same purpose, and that's to operate the Git version control system on your local machine, okay? So if you want to track changes, you can just use Git right there on your computer. GitHub is actually a web application, and it didn't come out until like 3 years after Git was initially created and being used. So GitHub it has Git functionality in that you can perform some of the same actions that you would with the command line interface on the website, but the website more serves as a place for you to publish your work so that other people can see it. Open source is like a really big thing. So people will use GitHub for their open source projects. And it sort of adds this social coding dynamic to project management, where if someone would like to contribute to your project, they can see it on GitHub, and then they can, get a copy of it on their local computer. They can work on it. They can upload their ideas and their changes to GitHub and then suggest that you incorporate them into your project. So GitHub is more of like if you took Git and brought friends and we're just working solo.
Okay, so you've mentioned Git, GitHub, Mercurial. Are there other tools that developers use for version control?
Yeah, so Mercurial, Subversion, and Git, those are like your clients. And then they also will often have like a server component. So that's kind of what makes GitHub work with Git, is that there's this other side of the coin that's operating under the hood at GitHub. Alternatives to GitHub would include things like Bitbucket, or there's the GitLab. So Bitbucket, I think, is proprietary, and I think GitLab is actually itself is an open source thing. So yeah, there's actually a number of tools to choose from when it comes to using Git.
Cool, but maybe the most like dominant in the market right now are Git and GitHub.
Massively.
Totally. Okay. Can I ask a silly question? Maybe what did developers do before these version control tools existed?
So I love this question because it sort of like it humanizes developers to a lot of people. The answer is whatever you would do. So if you would make a copy of your file and rename it to version 2, make another copy of your file and name it version 3, then make another copy and call it final, and then make another copy and call it final. So there is plenty of that going on. People who are trying not to go that direction, developers that would be working in the same building or on the same network, even if they were in separate buildings, sometimes what they would do is they would store their code centrally. So everybody could, through the internet or the local network in their office, they could access the files. But people had to work really carefully to communicate with one another. Hey, I'm working on these files right here. Please don't touch those files. People were stepping on each other's feet constantly. And then
communication and a little foot stepping seems to be the how that would turn out.
To put it mildly, yes.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm glad that these have been that these now exist. It's almost like going from using Microsoft Word to using Google Docs, being able to share those versions with the team.
Yeah, there's the collaborative aspect is, I think, what makes version control. There's the nice benefit of being able to go back to different versions, but really the collaborative aspect, I think, is where it shines.
Cool. Okay, so Tim, because I have you here and you've, I'm sure, used these terms a ton, can we do a quick vocab lightning round? Will you tell us what a commit is?
Yes. So in the simplest terms, commit is like saving for Git. It's when you tell Git, okay, I would like to commit to my current changes, and I want to let it be known that this is a legitimate version of my project. So cool. People will slice up their work either in big chunks or small chunks, but the idea is as you make changes, you make commits so that you are creating those checkpoints. So commit is a checkpoint in time for your project.
How about a clone? What is a clone?
So a clone's interesting because Git is actually a specific type of version control system. And I think the majority of the popular version control systems have adopted this, but it's what's called a distributed version control system. So what a clone is when you get an entire copy of a project, including all of its commits, which we've talked about, all of its branches, everything about that project gets copied onto another system. So a clone is a full copy of a project.
Okay, and then this one might be a little bit more GitHub related, but what is a fork?
Okay, so forking is an important part of open source contribution, at least when you're working to help with someone else's project, something that you're not you don't have direct control over their repository. A fork is it's like a sideways clone, where you can think of it as like a fork in the road, right? There's a commit history for a specific project, but then if you would like to fork off of that project, you can basically pick up where they left off and take a project in a completely different direction if you want. It just so happens that part of collaborative workflow between strangers on GitHub involves forking. Someone is going to make a sideways copy of your project, make some changes to it, and then they can actually ask you to incorporate those changes back into your project.
And then finally, what is a pull request? This is what I hear a lot.
Yeah, so the pull request is that last step. It's not reliant on forks. You don't have to have a fork in order to make a pull request. But the idea is, and this is definitely a GitHub specific thing. A pull request is basically just one developer uploading a series of commits that they've made to make changes to the project. And then they are basically creating a record on GitHub that notifies the maintainer of the main project. And they say, hey, I think that these changes to the project should be incorporated in the project proper. So you're literally asking the maintainer, will you please pull my changes into your project?
And then the maintainer has to decide, like, yes, I'm going to accept these.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Cool. Okay, are there any other jargon vocab terms that you find yourself saying a lot when you're talking about Git that I'm missing?
Yeah, so it's probably a good idea to just touch on the concept of what's called a branch. And a branch is, if we talked about what a commit is, and a commit is just a snapshot in time of your project. A branch is sort of like an alternate timeline where you have the project, it's got its own commit history. But then if you would like to make additions, typically what we do when we're using GitHub properly is not make commits on the trunk of the project, meaning we don't just make commits in one timeline of the project. We actually create what's called a branch. And that keeps any commits that you add, any changes that you're adding to the project, it keeps them from actually affecting the project itself until you submit a pull request and somebody approves it.
For sure. And so as an instructor at a coding boot camp, I mean, you're kind of teaching the next, generation of developers. Why is it important to you and to LearningFuze that the curriculum covers Git just in general?
Yeah. So I would say the main thing is, yes, absolutely. It's like a required skill in modern development. And shockingly, that's pretty new, actually. I would say that is maybe the wide acceptance that version control is something that you absolutely need to do. It's probably less than 20 years old. Like, it's shocking how recent that is, even though it's so painful working without it. That being said, so yeah, it's a critical skill. It's expected of developers to know version control. I would say another really important point to keep in mind is that no non-trivial software is built by one person. So once you start getting up into, there's exceptions to everything, obviously, but once you start getting up into like commercial software that's like really responsible for business processes or revenue generation, things like that, more than one person worked on it. So having an understanding of using version control for collaboration is absolutely critical. And then lastly, there's like a very practical point, and that is at LearningFuze, you can't turn anything in without using Git properly.
That kind of builds the habit, right? If that's how you're learning and being graded on work, then that's a great way to build the habit.
Yeah, I don't even
if you
didn't check it in with Git. So
does that mean that LearningFuze students are learning Git and version control like first thing when they start class, or when do you teach it in the curriculum?
First thing. You literally cannot start working without learning it.
Yeah. Is it only software engineers who use Git, or like what other roles would use it in tech? In DevOps, like data science, UX designers, are they all using some version of version control?
So that's an interesting question. I know obviously software developers are using it, and DevOps people are also using it. There's this thing called like configuration as code or infrastructure as code. So people who are getting into like the weeds of like Docker and Kubernetes and all that stuff, they're writing a lot of configuration management, but it's still just in plain text files like HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. So you can git add, git commit, git push, etc. And Git has some really cool features called hooks. So if, for example, a platform like GitHub or Bitbucket receives commits that you're pushing, that can trigger some automated processes. And DevOps is, one of the purposes of DevOps is to kind of like streamline delivery. So let's say a software developer makes changes to a project and the pull request gets approved, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, we're going to incorporate these changes in our project. The DevOps team will have incorporated some configurations so that the Git server can kick off a deployment, for example. So maybe it deploys to like a staging server automatically. So software development, DevOps, absolutely. Anything that involves a lot of plain text configuration, absolutely. The UI UX folks and the data science folks, like that's actually something I'm still learning about, because I do have experience working with a dedicated designer, and designers work in their favorite programs, and in this case it was something like Sketch. And so without version control, you can imagine what we were doing. We had version 2, version 3, final, all that fun stuff going on. And so immediately I just started doing research at the time of like, there's got to be version control for UI, UX people. And in preparation for our meeting here, I kind of checked in on that. And I think that UI, UX and data science are still kind of figuring out what their best practices are for version control.
Right. It seems like those programs like Figma and Sketch would probably have to build version control into their software, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to the designer doing that process of version control because they're working like exclusively in that software.
Yeah, and a lot of people are absolutely trying to attack the problem because it's version control changes your life.
And design is like the perfect use case for it, right? Like so many tiny changes. Well, and then I often will hear that, when a bootcamp grad is applying to jobs, keep your GitHub up to date, show that you're using it every day. We could see when you shared your screen and showed your own GitHub account, like you've got a lot of commits there. You've got a lot of green boxes.
We call it contributions.
Contributions. Okay. So why is that? How do employers look at GitHub?
Yeah. So, the basic theory is that if you'd like to be a professional developer, you like coding enough to be willing to do it full time as a career, right? As like a job. So a really good way to demonstrate your willingness to code is to actually do it. So you basically, you learn new things, you commit your work, you commit what you're learning, you work on a side project, you commit, make sure you're following Git flow, obviously. But employers would like to see that you're actively coding so that they can feel good about giving you a coding position.
That makes sense. Makes perfect sense. And finally, Tim, I want to let you get back to your day, but I don't want to let you leave without telling us your favorite resources or tutorials, documentation, anything that you recommend for beginners so that they could like show up to their first day of LearningFuze already versed in Git knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's like 3 levels, and we'll share some links, but Free Code Camp has a really good video tutorial that introduces and kind of recaps all the things that I just went through, but much slower and a little bit more detail too. So that there's that. I would say that's a really good introduction to Git and GitHub. The next thing after that is there's actually a book called Pro Git, and it's free. You can get it at the actual Git website, the website for the Git source control management system, alongside their documentation. And the book is very good. It explains why Git, it explains the history of Git, and it explains these higher level concepts that you're going to interact with most frequently as a user of Git. And then for people who are feeling really spicy, there is actually a quote unquote advanced Git tutorial by a guy named Tim Berglund, and he goes through what is happening under the covers when you're working with Git in much more detail than what I went through. And I found that to be super useful because there are aspects of Git that you can leverage depending on your use cases. So for example, I mentioned our students can't turn anything in if they don't actually use Git to turn it in. And I actually used that particular resource to kind of help build the software that I use to track student progress.
Very cool. Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing those with us. And I think that is a perfect place to wrap up. So thank you so much, Tim, for joining us and walking through Git. This was really interesting. I feel like I learned a lot. And thank you for tuning in. All of our viewers, leave us a comment and let us know which topic you'd like to see explained in our next YouTube video. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks, Tim.